This talk because tomorrow we're going to be in Tresco Gardens. I know for some of you this is the highlight of the cruise. You haven't been before. Now the last time we were there were guides offered. They were the horticulture students, and they took everybody and took them round the garden and said, and that's a such and such, and that's a such and such, and that's a such and such. And they came back and they said, we didn't learn anything. So I thought, I don't know what the arrangements are for tomorrow, and Brian's not quite sure at this stage. So I thought some of you, all of you may be going independently, or some of you will go independently. And if you've not been, I thought I would try and give you a little bit of background to the island and the gardens, but also what there is to look for, so you can go your own way. But let's start with, oh, there's the boats. Right. To put it in context, a lot of you will know the Gulf Stream, warm current running from basically the Caribbean up the east coast of the US, across the Atlantic, and then feeding up basically up the west coast of the British Isles. And of course Cornwall is sitting right down here, and the Scilly Isles are just off of there, so they benefit from that warm current. Hence you can grow a lot of things that I certainly can't grow where I am near London. However, it's not all straightforward for them, because there are the Isles of Scilly. You're not supposed to call them the Scilly Isles, you're supposed to call them the Isles of Scilly. They get very fussy about it. But a key thing is, there's Tresco Gardens, but there's the prevailing wind. So not only do you get that warm current, you get the Atlantic gales coming straight across the Atlantic, and they hit the Isles of Scilly. And one of the reasons that the gardens were established where they are, shown by the top arrow, is because you get the shelter from the other islands. Not complete shelter, but some. And again, to put the islands in context, this is a nautical map. This is St Anne's, the main island where Hewtown is, and this is Tresco, and the gardens are here. Where you see the dark blue, that is shallow water. And there is a lot of shallow water around the Isles of Scilly, as you can see. And any of you have heard about the boat, the Solonian, that goes from Penzance to the Isles of Scilly, will know it's not a very nice boat to go on, because it has a flat bottom. And it's virtually no keel, and the reason is because of all this shallow water. And we have a bigger keel than the Solonian, so we will not be docking. There's not actually a place for us to dock. We are going to be berthed out in the roads, and when I last spoke to the captain, we're going to be berthed somewhere here in tendering, but sometimes we berth up there. Right. So, right, there's what the islands look like. This here is the main island, St Anne's with Hewtown. There's Tresco. And that's looking at it aerially. There's where the gardens are. That's where I think we will be landing. Certainly if we're anchored off of Hewtown, we will be, but occasionally we anchor and get to the island up there. And so walk either way to the gardens. It's about, if I remember rightly, about half a mile, regardless of where we go from. Now, the last time we were there, which was I think about 5 years or 6 years ago, we landed down here in the quay at the bottom, and we're walking to the gardens through the sand dunes. It's a proper path, no problem, but the agapanthus were out. Oh. Just covering the sand dunes. Now, we're a little bit earlier than the last time, but I think they will be out. I noticed today in the gardens at Johnson Castle, the agapanthus were out, and they certainly should be there because it's even warmer. Anyway, to our story of Tresco. It starts with this man, Augustus Smith, born in 1804, born at Ashlands Hall in Berkhamsted. He was a very wealthy man. He had made his money from Smith's Bank, which he owned in London. He also had business interests in China. But he also was a great philanthropist. And in his native Berkhamsted, he actually funded education, schools for the education of all the children in the town, rich and poor. And to this day, the school in Berkhamsted, there is an Augustus Smith scholarship for students. Another thing that he did was in about 1860, Lord Brownlow, who lived locally, tried to enclose the Berkhamsted Common, and he put up a 5-foot fence all round it. And Smith, with his own money, hired a trainload of navvies from London, and he tore down the fence and threw it at the gates of Brownlow's house. So that's what he did. And then in 1834, he moved to the Isles of Scilly. And once again, he became very much the philanthropist. He bought a long-term lease or a permanent lease of the islands from the Duchy of Cornwall. And for those of you who don't know the British things, today the Prince Charles is the Duke of Cornwall, so it's his. Well, they bought it for £20,000, which is 2 million probably in today's money. And he set about changing the way things were on the island. The first thing he did was to build a new pier at Hughtown, and we'll be landing on that at some stage, probably tomorrow. And then when you see it, you'll realise why we can't berth at the pier. He also established schools in all of the islands, and he made it compulsory for the children to go to school, and that was about 30 or 40 years before the rest of Britain. And he gave himself a fancy title which he called Lord Proprietor of the Isles of Scilly. But because of what he had done with his schools, a lot of the boys, instead of becoming labourers, went to sea and did their time at sea. Very fortunate, because they sent him back plants for his garden later on. And the girls, instead of going into service, went into better paid jobs and so on. So he really was quite a game changer. However, he initially lived on the island of St Mary's, but he found it was a bit too busy for him, and he wanted privacy. So he decided to move to Tresco. And he started building a house very close to what was the remains of Tresco Abbey. This had been established in the 9th century under the Bishop of Tavistock, fell into disrepair in the 16th century, and not much of it left, but he built his house close by. And there you see the house that he built. Now, not all of that. The square tower to the right was a later addition, which I'll not just show it there, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Now, the thing that he found when he went to the islands is absolutely nothing to protect the land from the wind. And of course, it's not just wind, it's salt-laden wind, which plants don't like. So he started planting gorse and trees, and he needed to get trees which would withstand the wind and the salt. And the two trees he chose were a cypress, and any of you who have been to Monterey will recognise the lone cypress in the 17-mile drive in Monterey, and Pinus radiata, the Monterey pine. Two trees which can really take the wind and the salt. And he planted hundreds and hundreds of these round the property. And then he set about establishing the garden, and there are some of these labourers in the early days, very well dressed, aren't they, doing the gardening. There's Augustus Smith himself in the garden in the early days. And what he did was he set out initially a series of terraces. And there are 3 terraces that run east to west. And these are a way of getting your bearings in the garden. There's the upper terrace, the middle terrace, and the long walk. And they run east to west. And they are, if you like, the 3 frames of the garden. And this is what one of these terraces looks like today. So if you're having trouble walking, that it's very easy. He then decided to link the terraces by a set of steps. They're called Neptune steps because at the very top there is a statue of Neptune which came off the SS Thames, a figurehead. And there you see the steps today, and there's an inset of Neptune. So you've got the 3 long walks and then the steps linking up. So that helps you get your bearing when you go to the garden. Now, Isles of Scilly were notorious for shipwrecks. As you could see earlier, the water's very shallow, lots of ships, they're sailing ships, blown aground, wrecked. And one of the things that Smith started doing was collecting figureheads off the ships. And so he has a museum known as Valhalla, and in it you will see all sorts of figureheads. There's a few. There's two. That one on the right is of Suitor Johnny from Burns's poem. And this one is of Tsar Alexander I of Russia. It came off a Russian ship, the Alessandro Grande. So you can go and see these. And then in 1870, Smith was given as a present by some German sailors whose ship was sheltering off the islands. He was given 2 tons of shells. Strange gift. What they were doing in the ship, I do not know. But he took these shells and he used them to decorate the walls of Valhalla, this collection of figureheads. So, putting it in context, this is a sort of schematic of the gardens. Down the bottom you can see the entrance where we're going to go in. There's his house, there's the abbey, there's the top terrace, there's the Neptune steps, there's the long walk, middle terrace, and down here Valhalla. So you can get your bearings quite easy actually. Look for these long walks. And by the time the gardens were well established, Smith had lots of tropical plants and things. These are South African plants. He had ones from West Australia, had them from all over. Plants that even these would struggle to grow in Cornwall. Now, Smith died in Plymouth in 1972. He's buried in a churchyard in Cornwall. This is a plaque that's in the church in St Anne's on the main island of Tresco. And he died without any children. Well, that's not quite true. He did have children, all illegitimate by his various servants. He also had a lifelong friend, Lady Sophia Tower. She figures over here. Frequent visitor to the island. Relationship not quite clear, but she spent a lot of time with Smith. So when he died, he willed everything to his eldest nephew, who at that time went by the wonderful name Thomas Algernon Smith Dorian Smith. It's a bit of a mouthful. And he said that he thought at the time nobody would want to take on all the islands. So he made an offer to the Duchy of Cornwall, put £30,000 plus £3,000 annually, and you can have the lease back. And the Duchy of Cornwall turned it down. So his nephew was then landed with the job of looking after things, which he did. So we come to him, this man also known as Thomas Algernon Dorian Smith. Now, when he took over, things were not good. The shipbuilding industry and the ships that called to the Isles of Scilly were dying off, mainly because we had moved from wooden ships that were sailing ships to, steam-powered metal ships. The ships were getting much, much bigger, and they weren't calling it the Isles of Scilly because the pier was too small, the water's too shallow. The other thing that happened that wasn't good was that the potato industry, which had been a staple of the islands, was losing out to to Guernsey and Jersey, the Channel Islands. And the thing about, of course, the Isles of Scilly, they could produce early potatoes much earlier than anybody else. But then, as I say, the Channel Islands picked up, and that was dying off. So the economy of the islands was not particularly good. So he had to deal with that. And then one of the farmers on the island saw an opportunity. He picked daffodils. Remember, the daffodils on the Isles of Scilly come into flower a full month or more before the rest of the rest of Britain. So this farmer sent boxes